Chattel slavery, the form of slavery where people are treated as permanent property, has existed for a long time. In chattel slavery, people were a commodity and were frequently captured and sold along with other goods. Chattel slavery did not begin in America. However, it is during the period of the transatlantic slave trade within American plantations that chattel slavery, the practice of permanent familial slavery, took on one of its most cruel and dehumanizing forms. Millions of people had their possessions, homes, and families forcefully taken away from them as if they were livestock. Fear of slave uprisings and the disparagement of African culture facilitated physical and emotional abuse, and in the Confederate South, this rhetoric and mistreatment would persist after the Civil War. The complete denial of rights under chattel slavery not only violated basic human morality but also stripped enslaved people of their identities, with slave owners rationalizing the misuse of their responsibilities through racist and dehumanizing streams of thought.
This form of slavery did not come from nowhere, as there have been many different types of slavery throughout history and across the world which have changed and evolved. The practice of chattel slavery has existed for thousands of years in many different places around the world. However, this documentary will consider specifically the practice of chattel slavery within the 13 colonies, now the United States, from the 17th to the 19th century. The first European settlers arrived in the colonies at the beginning of the 17th century, settling in Jamestown along with other small towns. After a series of diseases and conflicts killed much of the indigenous population, European settlers began searching for another source of cheap labor. Chattel slavery began in the colonies in 1620, when the first people who were enslaved were brought from Africa. Slavery soon became the standard means of production for luxury goods, especially in southern colonies. Massive amounts of sugar and tobacco were grown using forced labor, as these cash crops were high in demand and extremely profitable. Chattel slavery on mass plantations quickly became a key part of the economy, despite the clear violations of basic human rights. As it expanded, its acceptance was normalized and it was a part of each and every colony's laws, with the last colony legalizing it in 1662. Enslaved people had a multitude of responsibilities assigned to them by their owners and became an afterthought as they were systematically dehumanized. One of the only options to combat these conditions was to revolt, and revolt started after chattel slavery became established in the Americas. In 1676, Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia led the government to increase the scale at which they enslaved people. In the early 18th century, a revolt in New York City led to increased legal restrictions on people who were enslaved. Although citizens had a responsibility not to infringe on the rights of other people, slave owners were keen on avoiding the social and ethical responsibilities of their rights.
This large-scale mistreatment of people required moral justifications to ignore responsibilities. Many people viewed chattel slavery as a justified means to enlighten so-called savages and barbarians to Christian doctrine, English language, and European or American ideals. Most certainly of all, people in power residing in southern states used their power to impose restrictions on what little right the enslaved people had. The Virginia State Act of 1705 stated, "Should any slave resist his master or owner, and the master in correcting such slave and shall happen to be killed in such correction, it shall not be accounted felony, and that the baptism of slaves does not free them from bondage. All children shall be bond or free according to the condition of their mothers." From these laws, a slave owner might beat an enslaved person to a pulp to set an example for not meeting impossible quotas or threaten to separate a family to encourage productivity. In this, an enslaved person loses civil and human rights as they face cruel and unusual punishment and have lost their freedom of expression. Slave owners disregarded the responsibilities of their rights to restrict the rights of their subjects by viewing them as less than human.
However, the chattel slave owners tried to justify their ownership over other people. Such justification certainly did not convince the people who toiled and suffered endlessly under brutal conditions. From the perspective of the enslaved person, slavery was unanimously horrible. They hated slavery for taking away their economic, social, civil, and human rights in favor for economic profits. In a book written by Olado Ekwano about his experience as a slave, he says, "When I looked around the ship too and saw a large furnace or copper boiling, and a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow, I no longer doubted of my fate, and quite overpowered with horror and anguish, I fell motionless on the deck and fainted. When I recovered a little, I found some black people about me. I asked them if we were not to be eaten by those white men with horrible looks, red faces, and loose hair." Enslaved people were horrified not only by the fact that they were going to be enslaved, but also by those who enslaved them. Depression and fear were common.
Slavery continued as the norm for many years. In 1777, one of the first legal documents was filed by enslaved people calling for their own freedom, with these people in Massachusetts saying, "The petition of a great number of blacks to obtain an estate of slavery in the bowels of a free and Christian country humbly showeth that your petitioners apprehend that they have in common with all other men a natural and inalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of a neighbors hath bestowed equally on all mankind." Appealing to religion and the goodness of the legislature, this argument would go on to be used heavily in the abolitionist movement, and small legal changes for the betterment of people began the same year this plea was published.
Abolitionism, the movement to end slavery, started at the end of the 1700s, when the condemning of slavery by religious groups acted as a catalyst for an anti-slavery view becoming socially acceptable in the religiously dominated world. To the abolitionist movement, all people deserved equal rights, especially basic human rights. With growing ideas of abolitionism, many enslaved people also tried to stand against slavery by escaping to the north and joining abolitionist or anti-slavery movements. One of these rebellions happened in 1800 in Virginia. More than 1,000 enslaved people armed themselves and tried to fight for their freedom. They were forced to disband, and 35 of them, including the leader, were hanged. Amid evolving thoughts of equality and moral unrighteousness in the institution of chattel slavery, many people felt repulsed by such practices, and the movement of abolitionism grew. By 1804, the northern states of Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts had all abolished slavery with state-bound legislature.
One notable abolitionist was Frederick Douglass. He was born on a plantation but escaped and became free in his early 20s. He spent his career fighting for the abolition of slavery and advocating for change, oftentimes writing in Lord Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. Congress appointed him as president of a coalition they created to handle the education of recent slaves. His work vastly improved racial equity in the U.S. government, and he was a key member of the abolitionist movement fighting against chattel slavery in the southern states. In 1854, the Republican Party was founded to be an anti-slavery party focused on freeing enslaved people, especially those in the Confederate South. They would be free to make their own life and succeed. The first Republican ran for office in 1856, and in 1860, Republicans first won the White House with Abraham Lincoln as their candidate. With the election of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, abolitionist ideas culminated in the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which redefined the Civil War as a fight against the practice of chattel slavery to reclaim the basic human rights that enslaved people had lost. The new government strove to fulfill the responsibilities that the government had previously failed to uphold by giving everyone equality and preventing the misuse of responsibilities. The government failed their people by denying enslaved people their rights, allowing some to have a baseless superiority over others, and to allow slave labor as a means of profit with no repercussions. While outright slavery became illegal after the Civil War, prejudiced views and unjust laws persisted as newly emancipated people scrambled to gain a foothold to live a stable life.
Chattel slavery in the colonies and United States was one of the greatest violations of rights and misuse of responsibilities that the world has ever seen. Within these brutal conditions, many people had their rights violently taken away from them under the influence of slave owners who ignored the responsibilities of their own rights. Slave owners ignored their responsibilities to severely abuse their subjects into submission with emotional torment, torture, and unending labor, as it was a common belief at the time that these people had malicious intentions. Efforts of slave owners oppressed cultural, social, and economic rights through physical violence, harsh labor, and emotional threats. The institution of chattel slavery within America began out of an apathetic economic desire, morally justified by a racial, cultural, and religious hierarchy that stole innocent people from their lives, scarring the history of the United States of America. As this documentary has shown, the effects of chattel slavery are not confined to history books. It continues to shape social and economic realities in America today. Understanding the truth means acknowledging not only the horrors of the past, but also the responsibility we carry in the present to dismantle its ongoing impact, a responsibility long neglected by the very institutions that enabled slavery in the first place.